The twilight years of the great monarch emerge from the haze of history not as a single moment of failure, but as a slow dimming of a once brilliant light. Modern archaeology, paired with ancient literary traditions, allows scholars to reconstruct a portrait of a ruler whose wisdom had astonished nations, yet whose final decades reveal a kingdom strained under the weight of its own splendor. The world he built had been unprecedented, an empire of trade routes, fortified cities, diplomatic marriages, and monumental architecture. But the same grandeur that dazzled visiting dignitaries also concealed the pressures forming within. As the capital expanded across the ridges of Jerusalem, its stone palaces rising above the terraces, the quiet murmurs of discontent traveled just as steadily through the valleys and toward the northern tribes. It is within this complex web of achievement and decline that the final days of the monarch must be studied. Archaeological excavations around the city of David illustrate the immense expansion undertaken during his reign. Layers of fortifications, administrative buildings, and luxury residences testify to wealth that surpassed earlier periods in Judean history. Yet these very findings reveal a crucial tension. Labor for such construction had been drawn from conscripted Israelites and subjected foreigners. Unearthed storage houses and bureaucratic seals show proof of a system that had grown increasingly centralized, demanding more from the population each passing year. Scholars note that while the monarch's reign began with national unity, these expanding demands sowed seeds of division that became visible during his final years. Ancient texts portray the king as a figure endowed with extraordinary insight, a man who could deliver judgments of astonishing clarity and compose proverbs that shaped cultural memory for generations. But wisdom in the ancient Near East was inseparable from the responsibility to maintain spiritual fidelity. Inscriptions from surrounding nations describe similar expectations for their kings. Prosperity flowed from devotion to the divine, and political missteps were seen as symptoms of deeper spiritual imbalance. As the ruler advanced in age, foreign alliances, once merely diplomatic necessities, began to reshape the religious climate of Jerusalem. Archaeological evidence of small cultic installations found on nearby hilltops has caused debate among specialists. Were these structures built under the monarch's knowledge? Or did they arise gradually from the private practices of those who entered his court? Historical commentary from later Jewish writers offers a stern narrative. They describe how foreign princesses, married to cement alliances with Egypt, Moab, Edom, Sidon, and other nations, brought with them the deities of their homelands. Their entourages established enclaves within Jerusalem's upper district, where altars, incense stands, and carved figurines became commonplace. The question scholars face is not whether such influence existed, it is widely attested, but how deeply it penetrated the heart of the royal household. Excavated amulets and imported religious objects found within layers attributed to this era appear to confirm that the capital was undergoing a subtle but noticeable shift away from its earlier exclusivity. This shift becomes central to understanding the monarch's psychological decline. His early reign had been defined by clarity, stability, and purpose, but the final decades hint at a ruler increasingly entangled in the demands of competing factions. Political marriages ensured international peace, yet spiritual concessions deepened internal fractures. The picture drawn from ancient commentary is not of a king openly rebelling against the divine, but of an aging leader attempting to balance political realities with religious expectations, an impossible equation that slowly eroded the unity he had once embodied. In the eyes of later generations, these concessions symbolize the beginning of the nation's unraveling. Beyond texts and artifacts, the landscape itself retains memory of his final years. The Judean hills surrounding Jerusalem preserve traces of agricultural terraces expanded to feed a growing population. Trade routes through the Negev reveal increased movement of goods from Arabia and Africa, evidence of the ruler's international reach. Ceramic remains from ports along the Mediterranean show trade with Phoenician craftsmen whose expertise contributed to the construction of the great sanctuary. Yet scholars observing this wealth note the paradox. The more the kingdom flourished outwardly, the more pressure accumulated inwardly. Prosperity built on the fragile balance of forced labor, heavy taxation, and religious compromise could not maintain stability indefinitely. The grandeur of the sanctuary, often remembered as the pinnacle of his reign, becomes an essential focal point when examining his decline. Ancient descriptions portray it as a masterpiece of cedar, gold, and symbolic ornamentation, a physical embodiment of unity between the deity and the nation. But by the monarch's final years, spiritual authority was no longer anchored solely within its courts. Midrashic commentary and early Jewish literature suggest that divine disapproval hovered over the city as competing religious practices gained space. The sanctuary's light still burned, yet its symbolic power was increasingly challenged by altars erected on the overlooking hills. These developments represent not the collapse of faith, but the fragmentation of it, a fragmentation that mirrored the kingdom's political trajectory. Scholars also explore the psychological state of the aging ruler through the lens of ancient wisdom literature later attributed to him. While direct authorship cannot be confirmed, many texts linked to his name display themes of disillusionment, weariness, and a profound sense of the fleeting nature of life. These writings have led to scholarly debates. Did they preserve genuine reflections from the final years of the monarch, or were they later compositions shaped by his legacy? Regardless of origin, the thematic resonance is unmistakable. The narrative they present aligns with the historical portrait of a king who witnessed the limits of power, the fragility of human achievement, and the heaviness of responsibility borne too long. Political tensions within the kingdom grew sharper during this period. Administrative centers in the northern territories, such as Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer, contain evidence of increased oversight and fortified structures, consistent with attempts to maintain tighter control. Scholars interpret these findings as signs that the monarchy faced growing resistance. The system of forced labor, once organized to build both the sanctuary and the palace, had expanded far beyond its initial intent. The people who once celebrated a united kingdom began to feel the burden of a government struggling to sustain its monumental achievements. These grievances did not surface all at once. They built slowly, like pressure beneath stone foundations. Among all the figures emerging from this turbulent era, none stands out more than the young official whose path crossed the king's in ways that would shape the nation after the throne fell vacant. A man from the northern tribes, he rose quickly through the ranks, praised for his competence and administrative skill. But ancient commentary suggests that his loyalty to the monarchy was complicated. What began as service to the king gradually evolved into dissatisfaction, fueled by the growing discontent of his own people. This development, though not fully visible during the aging ruler's lifetime, would soon bring the kingdom to the brink of division. The portrait of the monarch during his final years is neither simplistic nor one-dimensional. It is the portrait of a ruler who achieved unparalleled greatness, yet found himself unable to sustain the balance required by the weight of his own empire. His decline was not a fall from wisdom, but a gradual entanglement in the realities of power, politics, and the shifting spiritual landscape of a nation growing more diverse than ever. Archaeological evidence, ancient commentaries, and the geography of the land itself converge to illuminate a final chapter defined by complexity rather than catastrophe. It was a time when greatness and fragility coexisted, when unity began to fracture, and when the legacy of a once brilliant king subtly transformed into a cautionary memory for the generations that followed. In these closing years, the monarch's achievements remained vast, yet increasingly overshadowed by the forces gathering around him. His palace remained adorned with ivory and gold, but its halls echoed with competing voices, ambassadors from foreign courts, officials managing taxation disputes, priests guarding the sanctuary's traditions, and advisors attempting to maintain political equilibrium. Even the most powerful ruler of his era could not silence the undercurrents of tension rising within his kingdom. The decline that unfolded was not the fall of a tyrant, but the exhaustion of a man who had carried a nation to heights it could not sustain without cost. This era, reconstructed through layers of evidence and interpretation, marks the beginning of the kingdom's transformation from a unified national dream into a fractured landscape of competing loyalties. And in this transformation lies the true story of the monarch's final days, days defined not by a single moment of failure, but by the slow accumulation of choices, pressures, and concessions that reshaped the future of his people long after his reign had ended. The architecture of the kingdom in the monarch's later years cannot be understood without examining the expanding network of foreign alliances that surrounded his throne. What began as strategic diplomacy, marriages arranged to stabilize trade routes, secure peace, and cement political ties, slowly evolved into a system that reshaped the very identity of Jerusalem. Inscriptions from neighboring cultures reveal how deeply these relationships extended. Correspondence between Phoenician merchants and Judean administrators, artifacts bearing Egyptian motifs discovered in Jerusalem's elite districts, and trade seals linking the kingdom with the vast commercial networks of Arabia. Each alliance brought new languages, customs, and expectations into the capital. With them came the arrival of foreign religious traditions carried quietly at first by ambassadors and royal brides, but growing steadily more visible in the city that once stood devoted to a single sanctuary. The palace complex, reconstructed through archaeological modeling, likely housed multiple courts, each controlled by a foreign princess and her accompanying retinue. These were not passive figures. In the ancient Near East, royal wives often acted as political agents for their homelands, maintaining influence through ceremonial roles, patronage, and the establishment of private shrines. Excavations in the Judean highlands uncovered small cultic installations, incense altars, carved female figurines, and ceremonial vessels typical of Phoenician and Moabite traditions, while scholars caution against attributing each directly to the palace. The distribution pattern suggests that foreign religious influence had outgrown the intimate confines of diplomatic households and spread into broader segments of Jerusalem's elite. Later, Jewish commentary describes this period as one in which competing loyalties divided the city's spiritual landscape. The great sanctuary still dominated the skyline, its gilded facade catching the sun across the Kidron Valley. But above the hills surrounding it, small altars began to appear, some built by foreign retinues, others by Judeans drawn to the exotic appeal of imported rituals. These installations were modest compared to the sanctuary's grandeur, yet their significance lay not in scale, but in symbolism. They represented the erosion of exclusivity that had once defined national worship. The spiritual unity achieved during the earliest years of the monarchy was slowly separating into parallel currents, each vying for space in the cultural imagination of the people. This transformation was not the product of sudden rebellion. It was the gradual result of shifting political priorities. In the ancient Near East, alliances were strengthened not through treaties alone, but through shared worship, shared feasts, and shared symbols. Diplomatic marriages created obligations that extended beyond national borders. When a foreign princess arrived in Jerusalem, she did so with the expectation that her customs, and in many cases her gods, would be given respect. To refuse could be interpreted as disrespect toward her homeland. Thus, the monarch's efforts to maintain peace and international prestige placed him in a position where religious boundaries became negotiable. Trade evidence further illuminates this shift. Luxury items found in excavation layers, ivory combs, imported perfumes, scarabs with Egyptian inscriptions, and Phoenician-style jewelry indicate a cosmopolitan elite with tastes shaped by global influence. Yet such wealth came at a cost. Imported goods demanded high taxation to sustain trade routes, caravan security, and diplomatic relations. The burden of this economic structure fell heavily on the common population, particularly in the northern territories. Administrative seals and taxation tablets discovered at sites like Megiddo reveal escalating demands on regional villages. What the court celebrated as prosperity, the laboring population experienced as strain. The political implications of these alliances appear most clearly in the rise of internal opposition. Among the northern tribes, where forced labor for public works was most prevalent, resentment grew toward the central government. Oral traditions preserved in later Jewish writings describe how local elders expressed concern over the scale of palace construction and the constant demand for new projects. The system that once unified the kingdom through shared achievement now became a source of division. As foreign influence increased in the capital, a portion of the population began to feel alienated from the identity that had once been their source of pride. At the heart of this growing discontent stood the young administrator, whose role would soon reshape the entire political order. Rising from humble beginnings, he distinguished himself in the management of labor forces for major construction initiatives. His reputation spread quickly, praised for his efficiency, respected for his understanding of common grievances, and watched closely by officials wary of his influence. Ancient commentary suggests that his leadership among the workers allowed him to hear the concerns that never reached the palace: overwork, taxation, and a feeling that the glory of the capital came at the expense of the ordinary tribes. This administrator represented a new kind of power emerging within the kingdom, a power grounded not in royal lineage, but in public sentiment. Into this environment stepped a prophetic voice recorded in later traditions. While the details of the encounter are debated, the symbolic message attributed to this prophet became a defining moment in the nation's memory. The ruler's foreign alliances were not merely political miscalculations. They were signs of deeper imbalance. The kingdom, though outwardly strong, was spiritually inconsistent and internally divided. The prophetic warning stated that the unity achieved under earlier leaders would not endure unless its spiritual foundations were restored. The administrator who heard this message would carry it with him, shaping his future decisions long after the aging monarch passed from the scene. Inside the palace, the ruler faced pressures he could not ignore. Foreign ambassadors negotiated terms of trade, seeking greater influence within the capital. Regional governors reported increasing unrest in the north and difficulties maintaining loyalty in outlying administrative centers. Priests of the sanctuary brought concerns about fading reverence and the growing presence of rival altars. Advisors urged caution, compromise, or firmness, each suggesting different paths, none offering a perfect solution. The king, who once commanded absolute clarity, now confronted a political landscape where every decision incurred a cost. The psychological impact of these pressures becomes visible in ancient wisdom literature, traditionally linked to the monarch. Themes of disillusionment with wealth, power, and the pursuit of pleasure reflect the inner turmoil of a ruler grappling with the consequences of his choices. Scholars debate whether these texts reflect his own reflections or the interpretation of later writers, but the resonance is undeniable. The man who once wrote of wisdom as the guiding path of rulers now appeared burdened by the weight of his own compromises. His alliances had brought unprecedented prosperity, yet they also introduced instability that threatened the nation's unity. Meanwhile, the sanctuary remained a solemn witness to these transformations. Archaeological layers around the Temple Mount indicate changes in ritual practice during this period. Incense offerings increased, and certain Phoenician-style objects suggest cross-cultural influence. While the core worship remained intact, the presence of foreign customs revealed a shift in societal expectations. The sanctuary no longer stood alone as the exclusive center of devotion. It shared the religious landscape with a constellation of smaller shrines. This altered spiritual environment mirrored the political division forming between the court and the tribes. Foreign alliances also reshaped the kingdom's identity in the eyes of neighboring nations. Inscriptions from Phoenicia describe Judea not as an isolated regional power, but as a partner in maritime trade, a significant shift from earlier eras. Egyptian correspondence reflects mutual respect between courts that once regarded each other with caution. These external relationships elevated the kingdom's global standing, but also tethered its internal stability to the demands of foreign powers. When the monarch attempted to balance these expectations, he found himself constrained by a political network that left little room for spiritual consistency. The impact extended into daily life. Jerusalem grew more diverse, with marketplaces filled by merchants speaking various languages. Foreign craftsmen brought new architectural styles and artistic motifs. Music from distant cultures echoed in palace halls. As the court embraced this cultural expansion, segments of the population grew uneasy, viewing the influx of foreign customs as a departure from ancient traditions. The kingdom stood at a crossroads: embrace global identity or preserve exclusive heritage. The aging ruler attempted to do both, and in doing so, satisfied neither fully. By the final years of his reign, these alliances, once symbols of diplomatic brilliance, had become sources of political fragility. Tensions simmered between priests loyal to the sanctuary, officials aligned with foreign courts, regional elders advocating for their tribes, and merchants dependent on international trade. The monarch, now older and physically less able to intervene directly, became increasingly reliant on advisors whose interests did not always align with the needs of the nation. Thus, the kingdom's transformation during this era was not simply a matter of religious deviation or political miscalculation. It was the culmination of decades of ambition, prosperity, compromise, and cultural expansion. The alliances he forged shaped the world around him, but they also shaped the forces that would soon rise against his house. As the ruler neared the end of his life, the fractures within the kingdom grew clearer, fractures born not from malice, but from the very brilliance that had once secured his greatness. These alliances, woven into the political fabric of the kingdom, set the stage for the next turning point in the nation's history. And while the aging monarch continued to wield influence, the forces shaped by these relationships were already moving beyond his control, preparing to reshape the kingdom the moment his throne fell empty. The internal tensions rising within the kingdom during the monarch's later years were not the sudden product of a restless generation, but the accumulated outcome of decades of expansion, administration, and uneven distribution of privilege. To understand the emergence of internal opposition, scholars turn to both archaeological evidence and preserved ancient commentary that together paint a detailed portrait of a society caught between loyalty to its storied past and frustration with its present burdens. As excavations across the northern territories continue to yield administrative seals, taxation records, and structural remains of forced labor centers, a clear narrative emerges. The prosperity of the capital was increasingly built on the strained backs of the rural population, especially those living far from the political heart of Judea. Regional centers such as Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer reveal layers of fortification and monumental building projects that indicate direct oversight from the central government. The presence of specialized storage facilities, workshops, and administrative rooms suggests a coordinated system designed to extract resources from outlying areas and funnel them toward the capital. Scholars find evidence of conscripted labor not only in these elite centers but also in the smaller settlements that supported them. Clay tablets and ostraka discovered in these regions document grain quotas, labor rotations, and transportation schedules. Together, these findings confirm that the kingdom had advanced into a stage of centralized bureaucracy unmatched in earlier centuries. This administrative efficiency, admirable from a governmental standpoint, carried tremendous social consequences. The northern tribes, whose lands were among the most fertile, whose caravans traveled key trade routes, and whose manpower had long contributed to national achievements, began to feel increasingly distant from the capital's priorities. Ancient commentary preserved in later traditions describes elders from these tribes meeting to discuss growing unrest. Their grievances were not against the idea of monarchy itself, but against a system they perceived as unbalanced. They asked why the capital continued expanding while their villages bore the weight of labor. They asked why foreign courts held influence when their own voices struggled to reach the palace. Shifts in the political atmosphere also appeared within Jerusalem itself. Members of the court, loyal to different foreign alliances, vied for the ruler's ear. Embassy halls, where Phoenician and Egyptian diplomats gathered, buzzed with discussions of trade agreements and regional strategies. Meanwhile, representatives from the northern tribes often waited in distant courtyards, their concerns overshadowed by international affairs. This imbalance of access contributed to a growing sentiment that the kingdom's leadership had become increasingly detached from the daily life of its own people. The issue of forced labor became a defining fault line. In the early years of the monarchy, national service had been celebrated as a unifying effort, building the sanctuary, constructing the palace, fortifying the cities. But as time passed, the system expanded beyond its original intent. Records found near ancient administrative centers show that workers were required not only for public projects, but also for maintaining royal estates, irrigation systems, and trade infrastructure. What had once been perceived as a communal duty gradually transformed into a heavy burden that the population could no longer romanticize or ignore. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of worker housing near major construction sites, simple stone structures arranged in rows, each barely large enough for a small family. These settlements tell a stark story. While the capital enjoyed luxurious palaces adorned with imported materials, ivory, cedar, gold, the workers who built these wonders lived in modest dwellings and depended on state-provided rations. This disparity did not escape the attention of regional elders who visited these sites, nor did it go unnoticed by the administrator who would later challenge the monarchy's legacy. In this environment, the growing discontent gave rise to new forms of leadership among the population. Charismatic local figures emerged, individuals known for their ability to speak for the common people and articulate grievances with clarity and boldness. Among these leaders, one name stands out in both archaeological interpretation and ancient literary tradition: the young official whose future role would reshape the kingdom. His position in the government gave him unique insight into the system's flaws. While loyal to the monarch in function, he remained intimately connected with the workers whose labor fueled the capital's grandeur. His presence among them, listening, advising, mediating, earned him their trust. Over time, his reputation spread across the northern territories. He became a symbol not of rebellion, but of possibility, a figure who understood both the needs of the people and the mechanisms of the state. In the eyes of later commentators, this dual identity positioned him as the ideal candidate to challenge the central government if circumstances demanded it. But at this stage of the narrative, he was simply an extraordinarily capable administrator, navigating a kingdom that no longer resembled the harmonious vision of its earlier years. As discontent grew, so did the influence of prophetic voices. Ancient writings describe prophets emerging from both rural and urban centers, calling attention to the nation's spiritual fragmentation. Their warnings, often couched in symbolic imagery, emphasized that the kingdom's unity depended on adherence to its foundational identity. These prophets did not preach against foreign nations, as earlier prophetic voices sometimes had. Instead, they focused their critiques inward, pointing to the erosion of spiritual discipline within the capital itself. Their messages targeted the decline of exclusive devotion, the rise of competing altars, and the complacency of officials who treated religious tradition as a negotiable tool rather than a source of unity. Historical memory preserves several confrontations between these prophets and royal officials. In some accounts, priests loyal to the sanctuary expressed frustration that their concerns were ignored or dismissed. One ancient tradition describes a priest who arrived in the palace courtyard carrying a sealed message of warning, only to be met with indifferent bureaucrats who prioritized foreign emissaries over domestic spiritual guardians. Whether literal or symbolic, this narrative reflects a broader truth. The tension between political priorities and spiritual obligations had reached a point where prophetic voices could not be easily silenced. These warnings resonated among the northern tribes, whose elders viewed the kingdom's spiritual inconsistency as additional evidence of the monarchy's failing vision. For them, the sanctuary represented more than a place of worship. It was the unifying heart of the nation. When altars appeared on high places near Jerusalem, many interpreted them as signs that the government had compromised its own identity. The kingdom they had helped build no longer reflected the values that once bound them to the throne. The monarch, though aging, remained aware of these tensions. Ancient commentary describes moments when he reflected on the complexity of ruling a nation shaped by both divine promise and human ambition. His administrative skills, once renowned for their precision, now struggled to balance the competing demands of political alliances, economic expansion, spiritual expectation, and public sentiment. Even his advisors appeared divided, some urging stronger control over the northern tribes, others advocating for renewed spiritual focus, and still others emphasizing the importance of foreign diplomacy. Inside the palace, the ruler's inner circle grew increasingly fragmented. Officials who managed international relations often clashed with those responsible for the sanctuary's traditions. Younger advisors raised in a cosmopolitan Jerusalem tended to support the presence of foreign customs. Older officials, shaped by earlier eras of national identity, expressed frustration with the shifting cultural landscape. This environment of competing ideologies created an unstable foundation upon which the monarch attempted to maintain his authority. The result was a gradual weakening of the central government's ability to respond effectively to uprising concerns. Regional administrators sent reports of protests in villages where workers demanded relief from labor rotations. Elders from northern tribes requested meetings with the palace, but often received limited attention. Meanwhile, the capital continued to pursue ambitious construction projects, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that these efforts deepened resentment. Archaeologists studying rural settlement patterns note that some villages from this era show signs of sudden abandonment. This phenomenon has led to speculation that families fled administrative pressures by relocating to more remote areas. Such movements would have further weakened the monarchy's control, as dispersed populations were harder to tax, organize, and manage. All of these developments converged during the final years of the monarch's reign. Internal opposition had not yet erupted into open revolt, but it had taken firm root. It grew quietly in labor settlements, in village assemblies, in the minds of young men who felt the weight of conscription, and in the speeches of elders who remembered earlier days of unity. The figure at the center of this rising tension, the administrator who bridged the gap between government and common people, continued to rise in influence. His leadership style, characterized by direct engagement and practical solutions, made him a natural representative of those who felt overlooked by the palace. And though he did not yet seek power, the path ahead would soon force him into a role that history could not ignore. This is the environment from which the future division of the kingdom would emerge. A kingdom whose internal tensions, shaped by decades of political decisions and economic pressures, now stood on the edge of unavoidable transformation. The opposition that had grown quietly was about to find its voice, and the monarch's final years would become the prelude to a profound change that would reshape the region for generations. The ascent of the young administrator from the northern tribes cannot be separated from the wider political currents that shaped the final stage of the monarch's reign. His rise was not accidental, nor was it the result of personal ambition alone. It was the product of a kingdom whose administrative system had grown so vast and complex that it required capable hands just to remain stable. This administrator possessed both the practical skill to manage large labor forces and the charisma to command loyalty among workers who increasingly viewed the capital with distrust. His emergence as a central figure in the nation's story is preserved not only in ancient writings, but also in the archaeological record, which reflects the pressures and imbalances he witnessed firsthand. To understand his influence, scholars examine the administrative centers where he once served. Sites such as Milo, which appear prominently in early historical memory, reveal construction phases tied to major state projects. Layers of large stone fills, retaining walls, and complex water systems indicate a sophisticated labor network that required meticulous oversight. The administrator's responsibilities in these locations were enormous, organizing thousands of laborers, negotiating materials from surrounding regions, coordinating with supply chains, and ensuring that deadlines were met for projects that symbolized the monarchy's power. Yet, the more he succeeded in his role, the more he became aware of the system's inherent weaknesses. Workers confided in him with grievances they would never dare express to higher officials. Village elders sought private conversations during his inspection tours, presenting concerns about rising quotas, failing harvests, and the erosion of local autonomy. Because he originated from the northern tribes, his presence among them was not viewed as the distant authority of a Jerusalem-based official, but as the return of one of their own. In many ways, he became the intermediary between the governed and the governing, a bridge that could sustain stability or, in time, help break it. While the capital expanded under the weight of its ambitions, this administrator traveled the landscapes where those ambitions were built. He saw the contrast between the palace's opulence and the daily realities of villages scattered along the hills. Scholars reconstruct his world through pottery assemblages, diet patterns, and settlement structures excavated across the region. The rural population lived modestly, depending on grain, olives, and wine for sustenance. their lives shaped by seasonal rhythms and obligations to the state. In contrast, the capital's upper districts enjoyed goods imported from across the Mediterranean, evidence of a widening cultural divide that mirrored the political one. Amid this environment, the administrator's relationship with the throne became increasingly complicated. Early sources describe the monarch recognizing his skill and promoting him to positions of greater responsibility. But with each elevation came greater visibility, and greater visibility drew attention from both supporters and critics. Officials loyal to the foreign alliances within the court viewed him with suspicion, fearing that his influence among the northern tribes could disrupt the delicate balance of diplomacy. Meanwhile, priests from the sanctuary observed his popularity with cautious interest, aware that his authority derived not from lineage, but from merit and public respect. One encounter, preserved in ancient tradition, marks a turning point in his legacy. A prophet, whose identity remains debated among scholars, approached him during one of his journeys outside the capital. The setting described in these traditions is stark. A lonely road, open terrain, and an unexpected meeting that carried enormous symbolic weight. The prophet delivered a message that the kingdom's unity would not endure. The monarchy, once a symbol of strength and divine approval, had strayed from its foundational identity through spiritual compromises and heavy burdens placed upon the people. According to the prophetic message, the kingdom would be divided, and the administrator would play a central role in its outcome. Scholars analyze this narrative on multiple levels. Historically, prophetic figures often emerged during times of social upheaval, serving as voices that articulated public anxieties. Symbolically, the message represented the growing conviction that the monarchy had lost touch with both divine expectations and the needs of the populace. Politically, it marked the first recorded indication that the northern tribes might seek independence or reform. The administrator did not act immediately on this message, but its implications shaped his future interactions with both the workers and the monarchy. Within the palace, rumors of the administrator's growing influence spread quickly. Court officials interpreted his popularity as a potential threat. Some accused him of fostering dissent among the northern tribes, while others feared that prophetic endorsement, real or rumored, might elevate him beyond his administrative role. Ancient commentary depicts palace advisors debating the best course of action. Should they integrate him more deeply into the government to secure his loyalty, or distance him to reduce his influence? These debates reveal the fragile nature of the kingdom's internal politics, as the monarch aged and the court fractured into competing factions. The monarch himself, already burdened by the complexities of foreign alliances and spiritual inconsistencies, faced a dilemma. He recognized the administrator's skill and the necessity of capable leadership in managing public works. At the same time, he could not ignore the rising tension between the sanctuary, the tribes, and the political elites. The administrator's presence became both indispensable and unsettling. Ancient descriptions suggest that the ruler, torn between trust and caution, attempted to maintain control through reassignments and strategic appointments. But his efforts only heightened suspicion within the court and increased sympathy for the administrator among the laboring population. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence shows that this period witnessed increased construction of shrines, on high places near Jerusalem and other regional centers. These structures, modest but symbolically potent, reflected a spiritual decentralization that mirrored the kingdom's political fragmentation. The sanctuary remained the official center of worship, but the presence of alternative altars, some likely built under the influence of foreign retinues, challenged its authority. Priests warned that the nation's identity was at risk, but foreign officials in the palace argued that allowing diverse practices helped maintain diplomatic balance. This spiritual shift directly affected the administrator's standing. The northern tribes, whose identity was deeply rooted in exclusive devotion to their ancestral traditions, viewed the rise of rival altars as evidence that the monarchy had compromised its sacred trust. The administrator, aware of these sentiments, became an unofficial spokesperson for those who believed the kingdom had drifted too far from its spiritual foundations. His perspective aligned with their concerns, yet he remained cautious, unwilling to confront the monarchy directly. Even so, his influence grew. Workers spoke of him with admiration. Elders sought his counsel. Priests discussed his potential role in restoring spiritual unity. And foreign ambassadors, attuned to political currents, began to observe him carefully, some with curiosity, others with concern. The administrator did not yet represent a political alternative to the monarchy, but he had become a focal point for conversations about the kingdom's future. This rising prominence soon led to confrontation. Officials loyal to the palace, fearful of losing control, made accusations that threatened the administrator's safety. The monarch, pressured by his advisers and increasingly wary of instability, took action that forced the administrator into exile. He fled to Egypt, a region whose dynastic traditions offered sanctuary to those who opposed the monarchy. This exile marks a critical moment in the kingdom's history, for it reveals both the depth of internal tension and the lengths to which the palace felt compelled to go to preserve its authority. While in Egypt, the administrator observed from afar as the kingdom continued to strain under social, economic, and spiritual pressures. His time abroad exposed him to new political strategies, diplomatic customs, and international perspectives. Scholars suggest that his years in exile broadened his understanding of governance and prepared him for the role he would eventually assume. Meanwhile, his absence only intensified expectations among the northern tribes, who saw him as a potential leader upon the monarch's passing. Back in Jerusalem, the monarch's advanced age made him increasingly reliant on advisers who lacked his wisdom and perspective. Factionalism within the palace worsened. Foreign influence deepened. Prophetic warnings grew sharper, and the sanctuary's authority continued to erode. The kingdom's unity, once unquestioned, now depended on a ruler whose strength was fading and whose legacy balanced precariously between brilliance and decline. The administrator's story, intertwined with these developments, had already become a symbol of a nation divided. His rise reflected the aspirations of the common people. His exile reflected the fears of the palace, and his return, still to come, would reshape the fate of the kingdom in ways the monarch could no longer prevent. The stage was set. Tension had matured into inevitability. The kingdom, brilliant yet fragile, stood on the threshold of historic transformation as the shadows gathered over the final days of the ruler whose decisions had shaped both its glory and its fracture. The royal household in the final phase of the monarch's reign was no longer the unified center of authority it had been during his early years. What had once been a tightly structured court, governed by a clear hierarchy and guided by a resolute spiritual identity, had evolved into a fragmented network of competing factions. Archaeology, textual traditions, and socio-political analysis converge on a single portrait. The palace was a place of splendor, but also a place of quiet disintegration. Its halls no longer echoed only with the sound of wisdom and command. They now vibrated with the tensions of foreign influence, internal rivalry, and spiritual incoherence. Examining the physical layout of elite structures from the era provides insight into how such fragmentation emerged. Excavations in areas thought to correspond with the ancient palace district reveal multiple residential quarters built around internal courtyards. These spaces were likely assigned to various foreign princesses and their entourages. Each quarter contained its own small shrines, storerooms, and private chambers. Archaeologists have found ritual vessels of non-Judean origin in these upper city layers, objects stylistically linked to Moabite, Ammonite, Sidonian, and Edomite practices. Their presence speaks to the very heart of the household's division. The ruler's international marriages, once considered brilliant diplomatic achievements, had introduced a diversity of religious customs that gradually overwhelmed the theological unity that had defined earlier generations. Scholars note that such religious diversity would not necessarily have been problematic in the courts of other ancient Near Eastern monarchies, where syncretism was common. But this kingdom's identity had been built upon a foundational understanding of exclusive devotion to a single deity. The sanctuary symbolized not only spiritual devotion, but also national unity. When foreign shrines appeared within the palace zone, their existence constituted more than a theological complication. They marked a fundamental shift in how the royal household understood its own role. Instead of reinforcing national identity, the palace had become a microcosm of competing international expectations. The foreign wives, each representing the interests of their homeland, often brought with them diplomatic expectations that stretched beyond ritual practice. Ancient inscriptions from surrounding regions describe how royal marriages functioned as political contracts. The presence of their shrines within the palace legitimized their status and ensured that their customs would be respected. This placed the monarch in a precarious position. To restrict their worship would risk insulting powerful allies, while allowing it undermined the religious cohesion of his own people. His attempts to balance these competing pressures contributed to a subtle paralysis in leadership, a hesitation that permeated the palace and emboldened rival factions. Inside these palace courts, political ambitions took root. Competing groups formed alliances with foreign embassies or temple officials, creating an intricate web of influence where loyalties shifted according to personal advantage. Court scribes reported to different patrons. Advisors formed circles around specific foreign queens. Priests of the sanctuary argued among themselves about how to respond to the rising tide of pluralism. The result was a household where policy decisions were no longer unified, but negotiated, blurred, delayed, or undermined by conflicting interests. Into this fractured environment entered the growing question of succession. The monarch's age was becoming evident. Ancient commentary notes declining health, reduced public appearances, and increased reliance on counselors whose priorities did not align. This made the palace a center of quiet tension. Each faction viewed the looming transfer of power as a critical moment that could shift the balance sharply in their favor or strip them of influence entirely. Whispers filled the palace corridors. Who would inherit the throne? Would the successor uphold the sanctuary? Would he continue foreign alliances? Would he reverse them? Would he reform labor policies or intensify them? These questions fueled intense maneuvering inside the royal household. The monarch's sons, raised amid luxury and diplomacy, were themselves influenced by the competing forces around them. Some favored preserving the elaborate network of foreign alliances, believing it essential for international stability. Others, shaped by the sanctuary and by older officials who remembered earlier eras, leaned toward restoring stricter spiritual boundaries. But none possessed the unifying authority of their father. Their political identities were rooted not in national consensus, but in the particular factions that had shaped their upbringing. As the court fractured, so too did perceptions of the monarch himself. Earlier generations had viewed him as the embodiment of wisdom, justice, and divine favor. Now, palace insiders saw an aging ruler caught between the demands of foreign diplomacy and the pressures of domestic unrest. His efforts to maintain balance were increasingly viewed as indecision. His concessions to foreign practices were interpreted as weakness. His luxurious lifestyle, celebrated in earlier decades, was now cited by critics as evidence of excess and neglect. Outside the palace, the northern tribes interpreted this fragmentation with growing alarm. Reports of competing shrines within the royal household were troubling enough, but tales of court rivalries, foreign influence, and indecision magnified the sense that the capital had lost its moral and political compass. Elders in the northern territories described the palace as a place where ancient traditions were diluted by the ambitions of foreign courts. Workers in the administrative centers spoke of a monarchy that no longer understood the people it governed. This deterioration of trust was compounded by economic pressures. As foreign alliances expanded, so too did the costs of maintaining them. Royal expenditures increased, lavish feasts for foreign ambassadors, gifts to allied nations, the construction of decorative palace wings influenced by Phoenician or Egyptian art. These expenses were funded in part by raising taxation and expanding labor obligations. For citizens already burdened by the demands of public works, the knowledge that their toil financed the luxurious rivalries of the palace deepened resentment. At the same time, the sanctuary, once the unquestioned heart of national identity, found itself in competition with domestic cultic practices that thrived within palace walls. Priests attempted to assert authority, but their influence waned as the royal household drifted from exclusive devotion. This weakened the sanctuary's political power, leaving it unable to unify the nation as it once had. The erosion of spiritual coherence mirrored the erosion of political stability, with both processes feeding into one another. The monarch's attempts to manage these crises were sincere but increasingly ineffective. He convened advisors, issued proclamations, and sought counsel from priests and foreign emissaries alike. Yet his decisions, constrained by the tangled alliances he had built, satisfied few and deepened the divisions he hoped to mend. Age made him slower to act, and political weakness made him hesitant. In earlier decades, his authority could silence dissent. Now, descent simply shifted to new corners of the palace. Foreign ambassadors observed these developments with great interest. In the courts of Sidon, Egypt, and Moab, the decline of the once formidable royal household was discussed with careful calculation. Letters exchanged between foreign diplomats, some fragments of which survive in inscriptions, suggest that surrounding nations anticipated a major shift upon the monarch's death. Some expected instability, others expected opportunity. All agreed that the kingdom's internal unity was no longer guaranteed. Inside the palace, the physical environment itself reflected the division. Archaeologists studying elite structures note architectural inconsistencies that suggest renovations made to accommodate competing priorities. Some wings were expanded to reflect the tastes of foreign queens. Others were altered to support administrative offices, newly empowered under shifting alliances. The palace became a living document of the political fractures within it, a structure that had grown not according to a unified plan, but according to the demands of rival interests. Within this turbulent environment, the absence of the exiled administrator, once a stabilizing presence, became increasingly noticeable. His departure had not solved the kingdom's issues. It had merely removed a figure who might have mediated between the palace and the northern tribes. Without him, complaints intensified. Elders demanded relief. Prophets warned of impending judgment. Workers whispered about the unfairness of their burdens. Each grievance echoed through a palace, too divided to respond effectively. By the final stage of the monarch's life, the royal household was no longer a symbol of strength, but a battleground of influences. Foreign wives maintained shrines in their private quarters. Palace officials aligned themselves with one faction or another. Priests questioned the spiritual legitimacy of decisions made within the palace. And the ruler, overwhelmed by the consequences of his own long reign, witnessed the silent collapse of the very house he had built. This internal disintegration did not announce itself in dramatic public events. It unfolded quietly, through whispered conversations, delayed decisions, competing advisors, and a spiritual landscape no longer anchored in unity. The palace still shone outwardly, its courtyards filled with the scent of incense and imported perfumes, its halls decorated with cedar and ivory. But beneath its splendor, the fractures deepened. The silent collapse of the royal household became the most defining precursor to the kingdom's impending division. What happened inside its walls would soon echo across every tribe, every village, and every sanctuary. The household that once unified a nation had become the house that foretold its unraveling. The great sanctuary that had once embodied the unity, devotion, and identity of the nation entered a period of profound tension during the later years of the monarch's reign. To understand this shift, archaeologists, historians, and scholars turn to the layers of evidence surrounding the Temple Mount and the hills that overlook it. What they uncover is a complex narrative, one in which the sanctuary remained outwardly majestic, yet increasingly overshadowed by spiritual inconsistencies that spread through the kingdom like subtle fractures in stone. The sanctuary itself, as reconstructed through ancient descriptions and comparative Near Eastern architecture, was unlike anything the region had seen. Its cedar beams imported from Lebanon, its golden ornamentation, and its carefully arranged inner chambers reflected both theological precision and political ambition. It stood not merely as a house of worship, but as a national symbol, uniting the tribes under a shared identity rooted in exclusive devotion. In earlier decades, priests operated with confidence. Sacrifices followed precise order, and worshippers perceived the sanctuary as the definitive center of spiritual authority. But the sanctuary's prominence inevitably drew attention from those whose customs differed from its exclusive teachings. As the monarch's diplomatic network expanded, the city became increasingly cosmopolitan. Visitors arrived from Egypt, Phoenicia, Moab, and other territories, bringing with them rituals, music, symbols, and deities, woven deeply into their cultural inheritance. These foreign influences did not remain confined to embassies or private residences. They seeped into the atmosphere of the capital, reshaping daily life and political expectations. While the sanctuary continued its rituals without interruption, the delicate purity that once defined its unique role was becoming compromised, not through overt desecration, but through the shifting environment around it. Priests noticed changes long before the common population did. They saw foreign shrines rising on the hilltops that surrounded Jerusalem. They watched as certain nobles attended ceremonies at private altars sponsored by foreign queens. They heard reports of incense burned in honor of gods not recognized by the nation's ancient covenant. And they observed the monarch struggling to balance political obligations with spiritual integrity. Archaeological evidence confirms that the hills around Jerusalem contained structures used for personal or communal ritual activity during this period. Some were simple stone altars. Others were more elaborate, featuring carved pillars or standing stones. Excavated assemblages include imported cultic vessels, figurines associated with fertility worship, and altars designed for burning incense. These objects reveal that religious pluralism was not hidden. It was present, visible, and practiced in close proximity to the sanctuary. The priests faced an impossible dilemma. To openly oppose these practices risked challenging the royal household itself, which had permitted or even protected them for diplomatic reasons. To remain silent risked undermining the sanctuary's authority. Their position weakened further as foreign wives within the palace gained influence, establishing private religious enclaves with their own priests, rituals, and political agendas. The sanctuary, once the uncontested spiritual heart of the nation, now existed alongside a constellation of smaller devotional centers whose presence diluted its symbolic power. This period is described in later Jewish literature as one of spiritual dissonance. The imagery used by commentators depicts the sanctuary's flame burning steadily but surrounded by shadows. The priests fulfilled their duties faithfully, maintaining sacrifices and cleansing rituals with discipline and reverence. Yet they could not ignore the subtle decline in public commitment. Attendance remained strong, but the people's hearts seemed divided, drawn between the grandeur of the sanctuary and the allure of foreign customs presented within the royal household. Foreign ambassadors observed these developments with interest. For them, religious integration symbolized diplomatic success. Their deities gaining acceptance within Jerusalem meant their political influence was secure. Some ambassadors were reported to have attended ritual ceremonies in the private shrines of foreign queens, further strengthening the bond between their nations and the kingdom. What they perceived as cultural enrichment, the sanctuary's priests interpreted as spiritual erosion. the monarch's relationship with the sanctuary also became increasingly complex. In his youth, he had taken great pride in constructing it, dedicating it as the dwelling place of divine presence and national unity. Early traditions describe him offering prayers of humility and gratitude during its consecration. But in his later years, burdened by political obligations and surrounded by advisors whose priorities leaned toward diplomacy rather than devotion, he became distant from the sanctuary's priests. When he visited, he did so with ceremony, but without the conviction that had once marked his leadership. His focus shifted toward preserving alliances, expanding trade, and maintaining peace with powerful neighbors, even when these goals required spiritual concessions. The sanctuary's changing status is further reflected in the administrative system surrounding it. Archaeological excavations in areas thought to be priestly dwellings reveal evidence of economic strain. Storage vessels showing reduced quantities of grain and oil, and signs of increased dependency on donations rather than royal funding. These findings align with the broader narrative that this sanctuary, though still revered, had begun to lose priority in the royal budget, a stark contrast to earlier decades when the monarch spared no expense in adorning it. Meanwhile, on the hills around Jerusalem, the rival altars gained prominence. Their existence symbolized not only religious fragmentation, but also political division. Each altar had a constituency, foreign elites, nobles seeking favor with foreign courts, or even local communities drawn to the accessibility of private worship. The sanctuary required discipline, ritual purity, and adherence to ancient tradition. The high places offered convenience, diversity, and the allure of practices considered spiritually exotic. Their growth reflected a society more willing to negotiate its spiritual boundaries than previous generations had been. This shift alarmed prophets who emerged during the monarch's final years. Ancient writings describe several prophetic voices delivering messages of warning centered around the sanctuary's diminishing authority. These warnings carried themes of impending judgment, not from external enemies, but from internal inconsistency. The prophets argued that the kingdom's strength depended on uncompromised devotion. Without it, the nation would fracture. Their words resonated among segments of the population, particularly those in the northern territories, who saw the sanctuary as a symbol of unity, now weakened by foreign influence. The priests found themselves caught between prophetic warnings and political realities. Some aligned themselves with prophetic voices supporting the call for reform and accountability. Others, recognizing the delicate political balance of foreign alliances, adopted a more cautious stance. This division within the sanctuary's own leadership mirrored the broader societal fragmentation. The unity required to sustain spiritual and political stability had dissolved. Yet despite all this, the sanctuary did not fall into disrepair. Its structure remained intact. Rituals continued. Pilgrimages persisted. But the spiritual landscape around it no longer reflected the clarity of earlier years. Its once exclusive role had become muddled. It stood as a beacon, but a beacon surrounded by competing lights, each drawing a portion of the people's loyalty. Its priests served faithfully, but they did so within a context that increasingly undermined their authority. One of the most striking elements uncovered in archaeological layers around the sanctuary is evidence of increased incense burning. Some scholars interpret this as an attempt by priests to reassert the sanctuary's importance through more frequent and elaborate rituals. Others view it as a response to the growing presence of competing religious practices, an effort to reaffirm ancient traditions in the face of rising pluralism. Whatever the cause, it suggests that the sanctuary's leadership was actively trying to address the shifting spiritual climate, even as the forces driving that shift remained largely beyond their control. The sanctuary's diminishing centrality became a potent symbol in the final years of the monarch's rule. It reflected not only spiritual fragmentation, but the broader weakening of national unity. A kingdom that had once been defined by its shared devotion had become a kingdom marked by divided loyalties, and while the sanctuary itself remained firm, the ground beneath it had begun to shift. As the monarch's life neared its end, the sanctuary's flame continued to burn, steady, visible, resolute. But its light no longer illuminated a unified people. Instead, it cast long shadows across a landscape reshaped by political compromise, foreign alliances, and internal division. The sanctuary that once represented the heart of the nation now stood as the silent witness to a kingdom drifting toward fracture, its spiritual authority fading even before the throne fell empty. The final years of the monarch's reign saw the emergence of prophetic voices whose warnings, visions, and confrontations formed one of the most defining and least understood elements of the kingdom's decline. These were not the fiery prophets of later centuries, whose proclamations would echo across generations, but earlier figures whose influence was woven into the political and spiritual fabric of the time. Their messages, preserved through fragments of tradition, later commentary, and careful scholarly reconstruction, paint a vivid portrait of a nation in which spiritual truth clashed with political strategy, and divine expectation collided with the ambitions of the palace. The prophetic tradition in this era operated within a unique context. The sanctuary remained the official center of worship, yet it existed alongside shrines erected by foreign communities brought into the capital through diplomatic marriages. Priests were divided amongst themselves. Some urged a return to exclusivity, while others, pressured by palace officials, advocated for coexistence as a necessity of international diplomacy. Into this fractured environment stepped prophets who perceived spiritual inconsistency not as a political compromise, but as a fundamental betrayal of the nation's identity. One of the earliest prophetic warnings of the period is described as taking place near the outskirts of Jerusalem, where a figure approached a group of workers returning from administrative projects. Ancient commentary describes him as wearing a simple garment of rough fabric and carrying a staff worn from years of travel. His words were not politically charged. Instead, they focused on the spiritual state of the kingdom. He warned that faithfulness, once the foundation of national unity, had been replaced with negotiation and compromise. He declared that a house divided in its devotion could not remain whole in its governance. Though his speech drew little attention from palace officials, it resonated among laborers who already sensed the growing imbalance between the capital's prosperity and their own burdens. Another prophetic voice emerged within the walls of the sanctuary itself. This figure, described in later Jewish writings, confronted a group of priests who served near the outer courts. His message centered on the rising influence of the high places surrounding Jerusalem. He argued that the very hills that once symbolized the nation's ancient covenant with the divine had become hosts to foreign rituals that diluted the people's identity. This prophet was not concerned with political alliances or economic pressures. His focus was unwavering. The sanctuary had been entrusted with guarding the heart of the nation, and its failure to protect exclusive devotion would have consequences far beyond the spiritual realm. These confrontations between prophets and sanctuary officials reveal the sharp divide that had formed within the priesthood. Some priests agreed with the warnings, acknowledging the erosion of spiritual discipline as foreign shrines multiplied across the landscape. Others, influenced by the palace, viewed the prophets as disruptive voices whose strict interpretations of devotion threatened the kingdom's delicate diplomatic balance. When foreign ambassadors observed rituals performed at shrines maintained by royal wives, they considered it a sign of respect. When prophets observed the same rituals, they interpreted them as harbingers of national instability. This divide reflected not merely theological differences, but a profound divergence in how various groups understood the nature of the kingdom's survival. Yet, the most significant prophetic confrontation of this era involved the young administrator who had risen to prominence among the northern tribes. His experience managing large labor forces made him deeply aware of the social and economic pressures facing the population. When he encountered a prophet on a rural road outside the capital, an encounter preserved in ancient tradition and recounted by later commentators, the moment became emblematic of the era's spiritual and political tensions. The setting described in these traditions is stark. The road stretched across rocky terrain, the sun low in the sky, the air filled with dust carried from nearby fields. The prophet approached, clothed in a simple outer garment. Without introduction or ceremony, he performed a symbolic act that later generations interpreted as a sign of divine judgment. The message he delivered indicated that the kingdom's unity would not endure. The monarchy's decisions, particularly its accommodation of foreign religious customs and the burdens placed upon the people, had fractured the covenant that once held the tribes together. The administrator, shocked by this symbolic demonstration, did not respond with rebellion, but with contemplation. This moment did not immediately change political events, but it planted a seed that would grow after the monarch's death. Scholars note that prophetic symbolism in the ancient Near East often involved physical gestures rather than lengthy speeches. These gestures served to dramatize spiritual truths in ways that engraved themselves into cultural memory. The act performed in this encounter reflected not only future division, but also the spiritual fragmentation already present in the palace. It suggested that the consequences of religious compromise would be felt, not only in worship, but in governance, diplomacy, and national stability. As prophetic voices multiplied, the palace grew increasingly uneasy. Advisors loyal to the foreign alliances dismissed the warnings as extremism. Officials whose authority derived from the sanctuary, however, began to fear that the prophets might be right, that the kingdom's spiritual inconsistency was eroding the foundation upon which it had been built. These officials observed how foreign shrines shaped the political culture inside the palace. They saw rituals performed in honor of deities foreign to their own traditions. They witnessed nobles shifting their loyalties based on diplomatic favor rather than shared spiritual identity. To them, the prophets were not political agitators but spiritual guardians attempting to preserve the nation's soul. Tension between prophets and palace officials escalated when some prophetic figures began addressing the monarch directly. Ancient commentary describes one such encounter, not within the palace, but during a ceremonial procession. The monarch, already advanced in age and increasingly reliant on advisers, was approached by a prophet who spoke openly about the consequences of accommodating foreign worship. He declared that divine favor had been overshadowed by diplomatic ambition and that the stability of the kingdom no longer rested on its spiritual foundation. While the monarch did not respond publicly, witnesses reported that the encounter shook those who observed it. Some interpreted it as a sign that the palace had lost spiritual legitimacy. Others viewed it as an act of disrespect that endangered international relations. In the sanctuary, priests debated how to address these concerns. Some argued that stronger boundaries must be enforced to protect the purity of worship. Others maintained that flexibility was necessary to sustain the diplomatic networks that had brought the kingdom prosperity. These debates did not take place in small rooms, but in the corridors where incense hung in the air, where sacred records were stored, and where priests prepared sacrifices. Their voices echoed through chambers that had once brimmed with confidence, but now carried a tone of uncertainty. The prophetic critiques extended beyond spiritual matters. They addressed economic inequality, corruption within administrative systems, and the widening gap between the palace and the people. The prophets argued that a kingdom rooted in divine principles could not thrive while its workers suffered under relentless conscription. Its tribes felt ignored, and its leaders prioritized foreign alliances over national unity. Their warnings linked spiritual inconsistency with social injustice, a connection that resonates through centuries of later commentary. Despite their courage, the prophets faced increasing hostility. Palace officials accused them of inciting unrest. Some prophets were silenced or driven from public spaces. Yet their messages continued to circulate through oral tradition, spreading from village to village, from worker settlements to rural sanctuaries. Their words reached those who felt disconnected from the palace's priorities and those who feared that the nation's identity was slipping away. As the monarch's health declined, prophetic voices grew more urgent. They warned that the kingdom's unity could not be preserved through diplomacy alone. They insisted that national strength arose from exclusive devotion, moral integrity, and just governance. Their messages formed a mirror held up to the monarchy, reflecting not only its achievements, but its failures. The prophets of this era did not predict the exact events that would unfold after the monarch's death, nor did they seek to overthrow the government. Instead, they articulated a deeper truth. A kingdom whose spiritual center had weakened could not maintain political cohesion indefinitely. Their warnings foreshadowed the future division that would follow the monarch's passing, a division not born in the moment of succession, but forged through decades of compromise. In the flickering lamplight of the sanctuary, in the dusty fields of the northern tribes, and in the private chambers where officials whispered about the kingdom's decline, these prophetic voices became the conscience of a nation struggling to remain whole. Their warnings did not stop the kingdom's fragmentation, but they revealed the spiritual and moral fault lines that made such fragmentation inevitable. The wisdom literature traditionally attributed to the monarch takes on a haunting new resonance when viewed through the final years of his life. Scholars analyzing these texts, whether proverbs of moral clarity, reflections on the limitations of human striving, or meditations on mortality, find powerful echoes of a ruler confronting the consequences of his long and complicated reign. Whether composed directly by his hand, inspired by his teachings, or preserved by later scribes attempting to interpret his legacy, these writings allow modern historians to approach his psychological and spiritual state during his last decades with unusual intimacy. In the early decades of his rule, the monarch's intellectual pursuits were expressions of optimism. His proverbs praised diligence, justice, wisdom, and discipline, virtues he believed essential for a flourishing society. But as political and spiritual fractures deepened, these writings began to shift in tone. Later passages within the wisdom tradition revealed disillusionment, the recognition of moral ambiguity, and the sobering realization that human ambition, no matter how expansive, cannot escape the constraints of mortality. Scholars read these texts not as abstractions, but as the reflections of a man whose experiences had altered his understanding of the world he governed. The transition from youthful certainty to the weary reflections found in these writings mirrors the political and spiritual decay unfolding in the kingdom. Archaeological layers from Jerusalem's elite districts show signs of rapid expansion followed by stagnation. Construction projects that began with grand intentions but slowed as economic pressures mounted. These physical remnants correspond with the tone of later wisdom writings, which grapple with the burdens of wealth, the emptiness of excess, and the limitations of human achievement. The monarch who once oversaw monumental building projects now reflected on the fleeting nature of labor under the sun, as later literature paraphrased. Scholars examining the evolution of his thought see clear connections between his personal regrets and the national condition. Many texts attributed to him explore themes of spiritual fidelity, moral integrity, and the dangers of divided devotion, concerns that mirror the realities of a palace increasingly shaped by foreign influences and competing religious practices. These texts do not condemn foreign cultures directly. Instead, they reflect the internal conflict of a ruler attempting to reconcile political necessity with spiritual responsibility. Their introspective tone suggests an awareness that the kingdom's growing fragmentation was not solely the result of external pressures, but also of decisions made within the palace walls. As the monarch aged, his awareness of mortality deepened. Ancient commentary describes him walking within the courtyards of the palace at dusk, gazing toward the sanctuary, whose flames burned steadily even as his own strength waned. He reportedly reflected on the legacy he would leave behind, not just the sanctuary, the palaces, or the fortified cities, but the spiritual and moral condition of the nation. His concern was not merely that his sons would inherit a divided court, but that the nation itself had drifted from its foundational identity. This concern is evident in the reflective passages preserved in later literature. Themes of vanity and disillusionment reveal a ruler who recognized that the political structures he built could not endure without spiritual coherence. The texts describe the limitations of wealth, the emptiness of indulgence, and the futility of seeking meaning solely in human accomplishments. These insights align closely with the broader trajectory of the kingdom, its wealth unprecedented, its power recognized across the region, yet its internal cohesion steadily eroding. Scholars also note the significance of passages that address the unpredictability of human decisions and the fragility of leadership. These reflections point to the monarch's awareness that the unity of the tribes, though once firmly established, could quickly unravel if successors lacked the wisdom and discipline necessary to maintain it. In this sense, the wisdom literature serves both as a personal meditation and a subtle warning, a recognition that the future stability of the kingdom depended on qualities that could not be guaranteed through inheritance alone. The political pressures he faced in his final years only intensified these reflections. Inside the palace, factions competed for influence over his successor. Foreign wives lobbied for the interests of their homelands. Advisors aligned themselves with political blocs that promised advantage under a new ruler. The sanctuary's priests, increasingly marginalized, sought private moments to urge the monarch toward reform. Each group saw the decline of his strength as an opportunity to shape the future, but none possessed the unified vision that had defined the early years of his reign. These dynamics created a psychological burden that surfaces in later wisdom writings. The texts describe the loneliness of leadership, the burden of responsibility, and the profound weight of decisions that affect an entire nation. They also reveal a man who had begun to understand the consequences of his own compromises. The diplomatic alliances that brought security but eroded spiritual identity. The monumental architecture that symbolized national pride but strained the population. The diversification of religious practices that pleased foreign courts but weakened the sanctuary, and the centralized government that sought order but created resentment among the northern tribes. Traditions preserved in ancient literature describe the monarch engaging in long periods of contemplation. He reportedly withdrew from public ceremonies, spending hours in private chambers reflecting on his legacy. Some accounts describe him rereading earlier writings, texts composed with optimism, contrasting them with the sobering reality of his final years. Whether literal or symbolic, these narratives capture the essence of a ruler who had begun to measure the difference between intention and outcome. Meanwhile, external indicators of instability became increasingly visible. Regional governors reported growing dissatisfaction among the tribes. Workers expressed frustration with labor demands. Merchants complained about the costs of maintaining alliances. Priests lamented the decline in exclusive devotion. Prophets continued to warn of fragmentation. These pressures, converging simultaneously, created a sense of inevitability that the monarch could not ignore. In this atmosphere, the monarch's reflections turned increasingly toward the concept of justice. Some later writings explore the difficulty of upholding justice in a world filled with competing interests. They lament the reality that the righteous often suffer while the wicked prosper, an observation that mirrored the kingdom's political climate. Officials who supported foreign alliances gained influence, while those who advocated for spiritual reform found themselves sidelined. The texts question the fairness of such outcomes, presenting a ruler wrestling with the ethical contradictions inherent in governance. The wisdom literature also addresses the theme of generational change. Many passages express anxiety about the future, emphasizing that the achievements of one generation cannot be preserved without vigilance and moral integrity in the next. The monarch's advancing age made this concern particularly poignant. He understood that his successor would inherit a kingdom rich in resources but fragile in unity. The idea that a single unwise decision could fracture the nation weighed heavily upon him. These reflections gained a sharper edge as his health declined. Ancient commentary describes his body weakening even as his mind remained active. He continued to offer judgments, hear petitions, and consult advisors, but his physical frailty limited his ability to assert authority. Those within the palace who once deferred to his wisdom now assessed his decisions through the lens of political opportunity. His presence still commanded respect, yet his influence was gradually slipping beyond his grasp. In the final phase of his life, the monarch reportedly turned his attention toward themes of ultimate accountability. Later writings attributed to him explore the relationship between human action and divine judgment, emphasizing that every deed, whether public or private, would eventually be examined. These passages reflect a ruler who had begun to confront the totality of his decisions, not only their political outcomes, but their spiritual implications. He recognized that even the greatest achievements could not obscure the consequences of compromise. Across the kingdom, the people perceived these shifts not through personal interaction with the monarch, but through the decisions of the palace. Workers noted increased uncertainty in administrative directives. Priests sensed instability in communication from the royal court. Foreign ambassadors observed hesitation in diplomatic negotiations. And in the northern territories, elders interpreted the monarch's silence as evidence that he had lost control of the forces shaping the kingdom's future. By the time his final reflections crystallized in the form preserved by later literature, the nation had already begun to drift. The monarch's writings, once guides for national unity, now read as elegies for a kingdom struggling to reconcile its spiritual identity with the realities of political ambition. His insights reveal not merely disillusionment, but a deep awareness that the kingdom's trajectory had shifted irreversibly. These reflections did not prevent the approaching division, but they illuminate the inner world of a ruler who saw the storm coming and understood, with painful clarity, that his earlier choices had helped create it. His final writings stand as a testament to the complexity of his legacy, brilliant in wisdom, formidable in achievement, yet shadowed by the weight of decisions that shaped the nation's decline. In the silence of his private chambers, surrounded by scrolls documenting decades of judgment, diplomacy, and spiritual inquiry, the monarch confronted the most difficult truth of his long life. That wisdom, no matter how profound, could not undo the consequences of a kingdom built on tension between spiritual devotion and political ambition. The final days of the monarch unfolded in a city that no longer resembled the unified capital he had once envisioned. Jerusalem, though still crowned with the sanctuary he built, had become a mosaic of competing voices and ambitions. The streets beyond the palace walls were filled with traders, laborers, priests, soldiers, and foreigners, each representing a different strand of the kingdom's identity, each carrying a different interpretation of what the future would hold once the throne was emptied. In this charged atmosphere, the monarch's deteriorating health became not only a personal struggle, but a national omen. His weakening presence accelerated tensions already simmering beneath the polished surface of royal confidence. Archaeological studies of elite tombs and burial structures from this era illuminate the reverence with which the people once approached royal mortality. The kings of earlier generations had been interred with ceremony and stability, surrounded by tributes of stone, metal, and inscriptions that reflected national unity. But the layers associated with the monarch's later reign hint at something different. Scholars have noted disruptions in burial sites, disparities in grave goods, and indications that royal funerary rituals may have been performed amid political anxiety rather than confident continuity. These subtle irregularities mirror the historical memory that his death occurred during a moment of profound instability. Inside the palace, the atmosphere grew tense as the monarch's illness deepened. His advisors divided into factions, each maneuvering to influence the succession. Foreign wives and their entourages advocated for their own sons or preferred political approaches. Nobles tied to the sanctuary pushed for a successor who would restore exclusive devotion. Officials aligned with foreign ambassadors argued for continuity in diplomacy. And in the background, whispers circulated about the young administrator in Egypt, whose return many believed was inevitable once the throne became vacant. The monarch's declining health is remembered in ancient commentary as a period of introspection and regret. Lying in chambers decorated with imported fabrics, surrounded by attendants who once admired his strength but now feared the future, he is described as gazing frequently toward the sanctuary. His windows, according to later writings, were positioned to capture the glow of the evening sacrifices. Whether metaphorical or historical, these descriptions illustrate a final longing to reconnect with the devotion that had defined the early years of his reign, before diplomacy, wealth, and political complexity reshaped his priorities. Reports from palace scribes describe the king's physical collapse as steady rather than sudden. He grew weaker each passing day, spending more time reclining on cushions supported by attendants. His voice, once resonant and commanding, became thin. He could no longer preside over ceremonial functions. Scrolls requiring his signature piled up unanswered. Advisors continued to enter his presence chamber to seek approval for decisions, but he increasingly lacked the strength or clarity to provide direction. As his authority diminished, the vacuum of leadership widened. In Jerusalem's markets, rumors spread quickly. Merchants whispered that the king had not appeared publicly for weeks. Priests, returning from the sanctuary, reported that the palace had sent no offerings for several days, an alarming deviation from tradition. Foreign diplomats observed the quiet corridors and reduced activity at the palace gates, interpreting these signs as indicators that the king's death was imminent. Their dispatches to their homelands, reconstructed indirectly through archaeological references and comparative studies, describe a kingdom bracing for change. The northern tribes, already disillusioned by heavy labor demands and the influence of foreign customs in the capital, viewed the monarch's failing health with mixed emotions. Some elders mourned the approaching end of a ruler who had once united the nation and elevated its status across the region. Others saw his condition as the final confirmation that the kingdom's trajectory had become unsustainable. Village leaders, uncertain how the next reign would unfold, began meeting privately to discuss whether they would accept new labor quotas, demand reforms once a new ruler ascended. In the sanctuary, priests performed their duties with increasing solemnity. The scent of incense continued to rise from the courtyard. The melodies of psalms echoed through its halls, and the sacrifices were offered with precision. Yet, beneath this ritual stability, fear spread. The priests understood that their position in the national hierarchy depended heavily on the next ruler's stance toward exclusive devotion. The recent rise of high places, the influence of foreign shrines within the palace, and the ambivalence of the existing monarch had weakened the sanctuary's centrality. Now, as his life neared its end, the priests wondered whether the next generation would restore their authority or push them further into the margins. The monarch's inner circle grew increasingly protective as his condition worsened. Access to his chambers became restricted, and only a few trusted officials were permitted to speak with him. Ancient commentary describes one of his final audiences, a brief exchange with a group of priests who sought reassurance that the sanctuary's future would remain secure. The king, according to tradition, attempted to respond but lacked the strength to finish his sentence. His inability to speak decisively symbolized the larger paralysis affecting the kingdom. The palace grounds, once bustling with scribes, craftsmen, soldiers, and emissaries, took on an air of quiet waiting. Courtyards once filled with diplomatic processions fell silent. Servants moved swiftly but softly, aware that any disruption to the monarch's fragile state could lead to consequences. The palace elite, despite their political rivalries, shared the dread of what would come when the last breath of the aging ruler finally escaped him. They feared not only the moment of his death, but the wave of uncertainty that would follow. Outside the palace, a different kind of anticipation grew. The people sensed the approaching end not through official announcements, but through the stillness that enveloped the capital. Travelers from the countryside described Jerusalem as eerily subdued. Market stalls remained open, but the conversations that once filled the air were replaced by hushed speculation. The kingdom's roads saw increased movement as tribal representatives traveled toward the capital, preparing for what they believed would be a political reckoning. The monarch's final hours, preserved in fragments of tradition, depict a ruler surrounded by advisor priests chanting prayers. His body, once strong enough to oversee armies and command vast administrative reforms, had grown frail. His breath came in shallow gasps. He requested, according to one account, to hear a familiar hymn from the sanctuary, one sung during festivals of unity. Whether historically accurate or symbolically inserted by later scribes, this detail captures the emotional truth of the moment. A king who had once stood at the center of national devotion now faced death in a kingdom deeply divided. When he finally passed, the palace did not erupt in visible mourning. Instead, a stunned silence settled across its halls. Those present understood that the death of the monarch was not merely the end of an individual life. It was the end of an era. His achievements were immense, his legacy complex, but his final years had revealed the cracks beneath the golden surface of his reign. News of his death spread quickly across Jerusalem. Priests in the sanctuary performed rites of mourning. Merchants closed their stalls. Families gathered in courtyards to discuss what the future might bring. Elders in the northern tribes received the news with solemn reflection. Some prayed for a peaceful transition. Others saw the moment as an opportunity to demand relief from the burdens they had long endured. The state funeral, though conducted with ceremony, carried an undercurrent of apprehension. The monarch's body was prepared according to established customs, anointed with oils and wrapped in fine textiles. His procession wound through the city, passing the sanctuary that had shaped so much of his early identity. People lined the streets not only to honor the king, but to witness a moment that would determine the course of the kingdom's future. The burial took place in the royal tombs, structures carved into the rock and adorned with symbolic motifs reflecting both ancient tradition and the artistic influences of surrounding cultures. Archaeological reconstruction suggests these tombs were designed to convey permanence, stability, and memory. Yet, even here, in the place where kings were laid to rest, scholars detect signs of tension during this particular burial. Irregularities in offerings, differences in ritual objects, and variations in tomb layout that suggest a kingdom unsettled during the funeral of its leader. As the final stone was placed and ceremonies concluded, the people dispersed into a city overshadowed by uncertainty. The monarch's death did not resolve the tensions that had shaped his final years. It exposed them fully. The strained relationship between the sanctuary and the palace, the resentment of the northern tribes, the influence of foreign courts, the prophetic warnings, and the exile of the administrator once favored by the people, all converged at the moment the throne became vacant. The monarch's final days revealed a truth that historians continue to examine centuries later. The decline of the kingdom was not sudden. It was the inevitable culmination of political compromise, spiritual inconsistency, economic pressure, and social division. His death marked not only the passing of a king, but the unraveling of the fragile unity he had attempted to maintain. With the throne now empty, the kingdom stood on the brink of transformation. The dawn following his burial would bring decisions that would shape its identity for generations. Decisions that would expose every fracture his final days had left behind. The dawn that followed the monarch's burial rose over a kingdom suspended between memory and fracture. The city still carried the scent of incense from the night-long vigils performed after his passing. Smoke lingered in the air above the sanctuary, curling upward in pale threads, as if attempting to stitch together a sky that felt newly uncertain. What had once been a united capital, built on the confidence of a single vision, now stood quietly, holding its breath as the weight of succession settled on every hill, courtyard, and marketplace. The people waited, not with anticipation, but with unsettled restraint, aware that the next ruler's decisions would determine whether the nation reclaimed its unity or succumbed to forces long gathering beneath the surface. In the palace, the question of succession had already begun reshaping allegiances even before the monarch's body was laid in the royal tombs. His son, born into an environment shaped by luxury, political complexity, and competing influences, was recognized by the royal court as the rightful heir. Yet his claim to the throne did not rest upon universal confidence. While the palace bureaucracy accepted the transition as a matter of inheritance, the broader kingdom had grown wary of the capital's priorities. For years, the northern tribes had endured heavy labor demands, watched foreign shrines rise within the royal precincts, and seen the sanctuary lose influence to competing cultic practices. The king's passing gave them the opportunity to voice grievances long ignored. The elders of the northern tribes gathered in the city to meet the successor. Historical memory places this meeting in a fortified town north of Jerusalem, where representatives assembled to request reforms. They did not deny the legitimacy of the monarch's son. What they sought was relief, a reduction in forced labor, a more equitable distribution of burdens, and a restoration of the kingdom's spiritual foundations. Their demands reflected the hardships documented archaeologically in administrative centers, grain quotas, taxation records, and conscript settlements that revealed decades of strain. The new ruler entered this meeting with the confidence of youth and the support of advisors shaped by the palace's worldview. Those advisors, raised within the royal household and influenced by the luxury of court life, had little experience with the realities faced by workers and northern villagers. They recommended a display of strength, a continuation of the policies established under the late monarch. They argued that easing the burdens would weaken royal authority and embolden dissent. Their vision for the future was a kingdom unified by firmness, not compromise. Opposing them were older counselors who had served under the previous king during his early years, when unity was maintained through wisdom rather than coercion. These senior advisors urged the successor to listen to the people. They believed that honoring the tribe's requests would strengthen loyalty and prevent division. The sanctuary's priests supported this approach, seeing in it an opportunity to reassert spiritual coherence. Whether out of humility or pragmatism, the new ruler listened to both sides. But when the moment came to choose, he aligned himself with the younger faction. This decision, historians agree, became the catalyst for the kingdom's division. When the ruler rejected the requests for relief and vowed instead to increase the burdens, the northern tribes interpreted his response not merely as political rigidity, but as a continuation of the palace's disregard for their well-being. Their unity of discontent crystallized at once. They withdrew recognition of his authority and turned their attention to the figure who had once risen among them, the administrator exiled to Egypt after receiving a prophetic message. News of the monarch's death had reached Egypt quickly. When the elders of the northern tribes sent word that they would support his return, the administrator left exile and traveled back across the desert. His journey, reconstructed by scholars through geography and caravan patterns, would have taken him through territories once controlled by the kingdom's trade networks, now echoing with uncertainty. As he approached the borders of his homeland, stories of the capital's instability and the people's unrest unfolded in the conversations of travelers and caravan guards. Upon reaching the northern tribes, he found a populace united not by ambition, but by shared grievances, heavy labor, economic pressure, religious confusion, and the spiritual decline of the sanctuary they once revered. They saw in him a leader who understood their struggles, who had lived among them, and who possessed administrative skill without the entanglements of palace politics. For them, he represented a chance to rebuild the kingdom according to principles long neglected. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the successor's court reacted with alarm. Reports of the administrator's return revived old fears among advisors who had once viewed him as a threat. They warned the new ruler that the kingdom's unity was at stake. Yet the palace lacked the cohesion required to respond effectively. Foreign wives still influenced court factions. Priests remained divided between reform and diplomacy. Officials loyal to different alliances disagreed on strategy. The successor, lacking his father's wisdom and experience, interpreted the crisis through the narrow lens of power rather than reconciliation. The moment of irreversible separation came when the administrator met with representatives of the northern tribes and accepted leadership over them. He did not march toward Jerusalem with armies or attempt to seize the throne by force. Instead, the division unfolded through public declaration. The northern tribes renounced their allegiance and established their own governance. What had once been a unified monarchy became two distinct realms, each claiming continuity with the ancient traditions, yet representing divergent visions of what faithfulness and governance required. The sanctuary's priests watched this division with grief. Though the temple remained in Jerusalem, its symbolic authority had been diminished by the fragmentation of the nation. What once represented unity now stood as a reminder of what had been lost. The rival altars on the northern hills gained renewed significance as the tribes sought ways to preserve spiritual identity without access to the central sanctuary. The new northern leadership began constructing its own centers of worship, an act that would shape religious history for centuries. Foreign nations responded swiftly to the division. Inscriptions from neighboring regions described the two new kingdoms separately, acknowledging their autonomy. Diplomatic strategies shifted overnight. Where once foreign courts engaged with a single, powerful monarch, they now navigated relationships with two rulers, each seeking alliances to strengthen their position. Some nations viewed the northern kingdom as a potential partner in trade. Others remained loyal to Jerusalem, valuing its strategic location and its historic sanctuary. The regional balance of power had been fundamentally altered. Archaeological evidence supports the rapid transformation. Settlement patterns in the northern kingdom show the development of alternative administrative centers. Pottery styles begin to diverge between north and south. New fortifications appear near border regions. The once unified bureaucracy of the monarch's empire fragments into two competing systems. The physical landscape of the region bears testimony to a political rupture that reshaped generations. For the successor in Jerusalem, the division represented a devastating reversal of his father's legacy. The palace, still adorned with foreign influences and shaped by decades of compromise, remained symbolically impressive but politically constrained. The sanctuary continued its rituals, but its national significance had been shattered. Prophets who had warned of the consequences of spiritual inconsistency now saw their messages fulfilled, not through divine judgment from distant enemies, but through the internal collapse of unity. For the administrator who now led the northern tribes, the division was both opportunity and burden. He inherited the hopes of a people seeking justice and the responsibility of forming a government capable of sustaining itself without the sanctuary at its center. His leadership would define a new chapter in the region's history, one shaped by the lessons learned from the late monarch's failures. And so, the kingdom that had once stood as a beacon of prosperity, wisdom, and unity entered a new era of tension and rivalry. Its golden age, built on the foundations of exclusive devotion and guided by the early brilliance of the monarch, ended not with foreign conquest, but with internal fracture. The forces that had shaped its decline, economic strain, spiritual inconsistency, political division, prophetic warning, and administrative imbalance, had converged over decades. The story of the monarch's fall from glory is therefore not a tale of sudden catastrophe. It is the chronicle of a kingdom that rose to unparalleled heights, but could not sustain the delicate balance required to keep diverse ambitions aligned. The division that followed his passing became the final expression of pressures long left unresolved. In the centuries that followed, the sanctuary he built remained a symbol of reverence and conflict, hope and regret. The nation remembered him with both admiration and sorrow. Admiration for his wisdom, sorrow for the choices that shaped the kingdom's decline. His legacy stands as one of the most profound lessons in ancient history, that a kingdom's greatness does not depend solely on wealth, alliances, or monuments, but on the integrity of its spiritual foundation and the unity of its people.